the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us. I also want to thank KEPW.org for carrying our radio show this morning. We really appreciate it. I'm going to get right into this. We have a guest with us, Mr. Karl Grossman. We got disconnected during the intro, so I'm going to give him a call right back. And he is with us. He is a journalist and a writer. He is quite well known, has articles in Counterpunch, is a professor at a university in Massachusetts or in New York, and I will let him tell you about that. Let me get him back on the phone, and he can give you his long laundry list of accolades that he has accomplished.
Good morning.
Good morning, Karl. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Yeah. So why don't you give your accolades about yourself? Why don't you tell us where you teach? Because I didn't ask you that exact. I know it's a long title that you've got going on.
Well, it's part of SUNY, like sort of like the University of California or any of the big state universities. And SUNY, State University of New York, is very big. It has 64 campuses. Wow. That includes the community colleges that are part of SUNY. And I teach at the State University of New York, SUNY, college at Old Westbury, which is on Long Island, about 25 miles from Manhattan.
That's awesome, I have to say. I'm actually really impressed by that. And you're also constantly posting in Counterpunch, too. If people don't follow that magazine, it's a really excellent magazine. And you do have your own website that they can explore, where they can get your really fabulous book, The Things They Don't Need to Know About Nuclear Power. There's a free copy of it on karlgrossman.com. Karl with a K.
www.karlgrossman with a K, one word.com. And because of the generosity of the publisher, the first book I wrote on nuclear power, it's called Cover Up, What You Are Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power.
Thank you.
Is available for free. Just go to my website and you can download the entire book. And I think the important thing, I structured it this way, the important thing about the book is I knew when I wrote the book, and I wrote it after the news of 3 Mile Island came out, I sat down and decided to write a book about the stuff we're not supposed to know about nuclear power. But I kind of knew that the nuclear industry, because this is their way, would attempt to minimize, attempt to discredit, try to deny what would be in the book. So what I did was use parts of government documents and corporate documents, and this is before desktop publishing. This is way back in when I wrote the book 79, right after the TMI accident occurred. So what I did was, with a scissor, cut out from various documents, admissions, acknowledged, where they acknowledged the lethal nature of nuclear technology, and I pasted them down on the flats. Those days, books were published, or a lot of books, through the photo offset process. So, just for example, there's a government report done at Brookhaven National Laboratory called WASH 740 Update, and WASH is for Washington. And over again in this report, when they're talking about how big a disaster could be, they use the line, and I'm accident almost encompassed an area that was the state of Pennsylvania. But importantly to me, a reader of the book, seeing that line, the possible size of the areas of disaster, would be reading it not from type, but this is the actual, from the document. In terms of what would happen if there's an accident, would our insurance cover us if we had to evacuate and all this kind of stuff?
Right.
Well, in fact, because of what's called the Price-Anderson Act, insurance companies don't. I mean, listeners should just go to their, if you own a home, go to your homeowner's insurance policy.
Exactly.
And you'll see a pair. It's called a nuclear clause in everybody's homeowner's insurance in the United States. And what it says is that if there is a nuclear, well, let me go to in the book. I have it right here somewhere if I can find it quick enough. Here it is. I actually pasted down from my policy. I took a scissor and I cut into my policy. And here's Allstate Insurance Company.
That's what you say in the book. You literally pasted it in there.
Yeah, it's a nuclear clause. This policy does not cover loss or damage caused by nuclear reaction or nuclear radiation or radioactive contamination, or whether directly or indirectly resulting from an insured peril under this policy. And so nobody thinks that maybe this nuclear clause was just Allstate's idea. Then I also somehow I got a policy from CNA, Continental Casualty Company, and they're the same thing, nuclear clause. This policy does not cover losses. So there's the actual, I mean, again, you can see that in your own homeowner's insurance. And then I go writing in the book, I write, they are the same. They will match your insurance policy. Check it and ask yourself, if nuclear power is safe, why don't insurance companies insure Americans against its hazards? And then I go on, when all the deaths and cancer and mutations began happening, the nuclear promoters strategized, and I then interpret the documents. But the book is very, I think the cover-up book is very useful as a handbook. So if you're involved in a situation, or if you live in Nevada and they're pushing Yucca Mountain, I have stuff about how the safeguarding of nuclear waste, because some of it lasts for billions of years, is impossible. Yeah. And there you can see that the actual documents where the government confesses that these machines are terribly dangerous, that the potential toll could be in, well, many thousands. Well, we know from Fukushima how dangerous this stuff is. But in Japan, not too incidentally, we also see, and this is why I call the book Cover Up, we see that operative function, the operative dynamic when it comes to nuclear power,
right,
is to cover it up. And just also from the book, and this is from the first page.
That's right. Your book is a handbook on how they handle it.
Yeah, you have not been informed about nuclear power. You have not been told, and that has been done on purpose. Keeping the public in the dark was deemed necessary by the promoters of nuclear power if it was to succeed. Those in government, science, and private industry who have been pushing nuclear power realized that if people were given the facts, if they knew the consequences of nuclear power, they wouldn't stand for it. If people knew that the kind of accidents that happened at 3 Mile Island, and that I go on to some earlier accidents, right. And now in the newest edition of the book, which you can get free online, just go to my website. I get into Fukushima and Chernobyl and all this kind of stuff. And that's been the way it's been since the development of nuclear technology.
That's right.
A cover-up, and it's happening
We're still
today.
living with the Manhattan Project secrecy. That's the thing. We're still living with that. I mean, your book was written in 1980, revised in 82, and then again in 2011. Everything that you said in 1980 is still pertinent today. Nothing has, in fact, they've dug in their heels deeper, especially since Fukushima. I mean, imagine now, at least in Chernobyl, they evacuated people through a large area. At Fukushima, they're rehousing them. They're bringing them back in. I posted a story on my YouTube channel last week. I was shocked. They have just voted to dump all those bags of dirt into the Pacific Ocean. That's what they're planning on doing. That's catastrophic. They've gathered up all the dirt, to repopulate the area, right? Thinking that that's going to do it, although it won't. But they're just going to shove that all in the ocean. It's like, wow.
Yeah, it's well, and they're Japan is in a. Well, I shouldn't say Japan as a country, but the government and the corporate powers in Japan would orchestrate this enormous cover-up, have people move back to these radioactive zones, spread the food around, the radioactive food all over Japan. And it's very important, too, listeners should know, that the two big corporate contractors during the Manhattan Project were Westinghouse and General Electric.
Wow.
You know how our government, U.S. government, likes to do things. They'll hire Wackenhut or some for security or some company, some corporation to do this or that. Well, a lot of the work during the Manhattan Project was done by these two huge then American companies, Westinghouse and General Electric. And then after the war, as GE and Westinghouse wanted to continue doing things involving nuclear technology, they became the Coke and Pepsi of nuclear power. 80% of nuclear plants worldwide have been GE or Westinghouse design or manufacture. And then people don't know this, but most people. But just a few years ago, Westinghouse was taken over by a Japanese company, Toshiba.
That's right.
And then another Japanese company, Hitachi, went into partnership with General Electric in its the nuclear division of GE. So now the Coke and Pepsi of nuclear power worldwide are two Japanese companies, and that's why you have Abe, who was the leader in Japan, busy trying to sell nuclear power all over the world, because now it's very much in large part a Japanese business. I can't imagine the Olympics going to be played so close to this.
They made a stadium. Libby Halebi reported that Toshiba came up with an idea. They reclaimed a lot of the wood in the Fukushima prefecture and made a stadium, an Olympic stadium in Fukushima. Literally, that's a true story that Libby Halebi reported.
Yeah.
So this is just the nuclear. I can't imagine they're actually going to have nuclear games in the Fukushima prefecture.
nuclear game.
Excuse me. They're going to have Olympic games in the.
Yeah, Olympic games.
I'm sorry. That was me. That's what I call them, the nuclear games. I'm sorry.
Well, there will be nuclear games because that nuclear poison, that radiation, that's going to be in.
It's not
in that part of Japan. It's going to be there, and they're going to dump some in the ocean. They'll contaminate, and has been contaminating the ocean. But that's the national sacrifice zone for Japan, right. and who knows what the future will bring. I mean,
this kind of leads into what we were talking about before we got on air. The sacrifice zone is going to be the entire planet if they continue with this one. I mean, really, you and I were talking about this nuclear reactor for space missions that is out in space that Trump has. You wrote a really great article. I think it was on Counterpunch, wasn't it? About
I write a lot for Counterpunch, and listeners should really go to of every website, and there's many now.
It's true
in this country when it comes to particularly nuclear power and other issues, but particularly nuclear power and environmental issues. Counterpunch. It's just counterpunch.org. People should check it out every day. It comes out every day.
It's the one place where you can really get a voice that talks about the real effects of the whole nuclear insanity. Really, it's the only place that really gives a good voice, a regular, consistent too.
Yeah, very consistent. Yeah, I mean, there's other websites that are good, but very good, some of them. But I think that Counterpunch, when it comes to these environmental issues, is the number one, and it's constantly providing information that you're not going to get on, certainly on NBC or CBS or mainstream media or
even
on many other websites.
Yeah, alternatives hardly talk about it even. I mean, this thing about this. I mean, what are they calling these things? RTGs. What are they? Let me see what this acronym is.
Well, RTGs was what we've been living with, or some people dying with, unfortunately, for years. That's radioisotope thermoelectric generators.
Right.
And years ago, they figured out that it's a little different isotope of plutonium that's in weapons. In atomic bomb, you have plutonium-239. But I was mentioning GE and Westinghouse pushing to perpetuate what they were up to during the Manhattan Project. And it wasn't just corporate America. It was those involved with the government in the Manhattan Project that wanted to perpetuate what they were up to continue. We created during the war this huge nuclear establishment because fission had been done in Germany in 1938, and a number of the physicists who were familiar with refugees from the Nazis, they went to Albert Einstein, and had him write a letter to President Roosevelt telling him about how fission had been done in Germany, and this could be translated into fission using uranium and so forth. 2-page letter. In fact, talking about pasting down facsimiles, I photocopied the letter, and a good portion of the letter is very important letter in my book, Cover Up What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power. And what that did was kick off the Manhattan Project, and secret laboratories were established all over the country. Los Alamos was the main one, and Oak Ridge, what's now Argonne National Laboratory. And then after the war, not only Westinghouse and GE, but those scientists and engineers at those secret labs, they wanted to keep going, so they tried to think of things we could do with nuclear technology. We could build more bombs, and they did, and they built under Edward Teller the super, the hydrogen bomb, and then they thought of, we can use maybe nuclear for food irradiation. We can zap strawberries and potatoes with radioactivity, and they'll keep longer. Or we could use nuclear to provide power for airplanes and keep the bombers. They were talking about bombers that would be able to stay up in the skies. You wouldn't have the scramble of B-47. You'd have a bomber up there that would be flying for days, and you can send that bomber over to the Soviet Union. And then they thought of, because they were building production reactors for plutonium during the war, The Nagasaki bomb was fueled with plutonium, the Hiroshima bomb with uranium, and they were able to produce plutonium at these production reactors that were set up at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation up in the state of Washington, and there was a lot of heat that accompanied the production of plutonium. You put this is a little technical, but you put uranium-238, which is not fissile. It doesn't split in of itself, but if it's in the proximity of fission, it changes and becomes plutonium-239, and that can split, that can fission, and that's why the Nagasaki bomb was fueled with plutonium-239, and it's essentially all our atomic bombs since plutonium-239. And in the hydrogen bomb, there's a trigger which is based on plutonium-239. But in this scramble, 47, 48, looking for other things we can do with nuclear to keep Westinghouse and GE in profits and to keep these engineers ultimately they were not just Oak Ridge and Los Alamos and Argonne. There were national nuclear laboratories set up all over the country.
That's right.
That Brookhaven lab that I mentioned, that's here on Long Island.
Oak Ridge. At Oak Ridge, I read a story the other night on the secrecy of Manhattan Project, how they keep it secret, and it was kind of interesting. They said it was sort of an open secret because there was like 57,000 people in this town. All of a sudden, it was a huge town of people, but everybody there had to keep their trap shut. And we had those all over the place. People had jobs.
They were all over the place. They were run by the Atomic Energy Commission for many years. But then the AEC was abolished. This is one good thing the Congress did in terms of nuclear technology. The AEC was set up both to promote nuclear power and to somehow regulate it. And the Congress, even though so many Congress people then and now are in the pocket of the nuclear establishment, nuclear industry, eliminated the AEC. And in its place, because there was a conflict of interest, it was so clear, trying to regulate and promote at the same time. So in its stead, what was created was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which still has the same culture as the Atomic Energy Commission, and promotes, neither the AEC nor the NRC ever denied a construction or operating license for any nuclear plant anywhere, anytime in the U.S. And then later on, the Department of Energy was set up to do the promotion. And these national nuclear laboratories all over the U.S., all of them are Superfund sites, incidentally. The folks at them are not too careful about nuclear technology. They kind of believe in it. In fact, at these labs, I've heard the nuclear scientists call themselves nukies. They're so proud of what they've done. But in any case...
The nuclear priesthood, they consider themselves the nuclear priesthood.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Alvin Weinberg,
that's right,
who for many years was the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory, he coined the term atomic priesthood, is what he said. In fact, I actually witnessed Alvin Weinberg, he's dead now, speak about how we should have a world energized by plutonium. And the problem is that plutonium, plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,800 years. So you multiply that by 10, and so you're talking about a hazardous lifetime of 240, a little bit more than 240,000 years. In fact, you should multiply a half-life by 20 to find out a hazardous lifetime. I'm talking about plutonium, man-made element created originally for nuclear weaponry, being around for 500,000 years. But in any case, in this period, 46, 47, 48, when there's this great push to see how we can perpetuate this nuclear establishment, one of the things they found was another isotope of plutonium called plutonium-238. And that has a shorter half-life, about 88 years. And it's very hot because its half-life is so much shorter, its deterioration rate is so much more rapid. And then they figured, well, maybe we can use this plutonium-238 They were talking about using it for marine buoys. I mean, if anybody out there is a sailor or has a boat, imagine if you go past a buoy and it was powered by plutonium floating there in the sea. And then also they figured we can use this plutonium-238 for, I mentioned the term before, in radioisotope thermoelectric generators, which would be very hot because of the plutonium-238 being so hot as it decays, and that would provide electricity. So originally, the satellites that were put up were energized by plutonium-238 until there was an accident in 1964, and I write about this I also have a book called The Wrong Stuff about the use of nuclear in space, where I relate how there was this accident with this plutonium-powered satellite in 1964, the SNAP-9A. It came down, disintegrated in the atmosphere. Plutonium was spread all over the planet, plutonium-238, and Dr. John Goffman, the late now Dr. John Goffman, who was both a doctor and a PhD, was a professor at University of California at Berkeley, and very much involved during the Manhattan Project days in research. In fact, some of the early research involving plutonium involved Dr. Goffman. So he knew about plutonium, and he long connected the SNAP-9A accident to a spike in lung cancer. That's the problem with plutonium. A microscopic amount of it, a millionth of a gram, breathed in, gets into somebody's lung cancer, and he connected the SNAP-9A accident to a spike, a rise in lung cancer among people on Earth. And that caused, the NASA, the Atomic Energy Commission, began to realize that, this is the optimal way to spread plutonium, putting it on a satellite, which if it fell, as the SNAP-9A did, would disintegrate in the atmosphere and its contents spread all over. So then NASA became a pioneer in the use of solar power, photovoltaic power cells, on satellites. And now all the satellites are powered by photovoltaic panels, as is the International Space Station. Still, NASA insists, and it shouldn't, but it still does, because it works in close partnership with the national nuclear laboratories and corporations that are involved in nuclear technology. It still insists on using these plutonium-powered RTGs for, they call them deep space probes, but that turns out, it's just like with the satellites. In fact, 2 years ago, NASA's Juno satellite reached Jupiter, powered electricity. Propulsion isn't, they're not using nuclear for propulsion. This plutonium is being used to power the instruments on board. In any case, the Juno satellite, a NASA satellite called Juno, Google it, you can read all about it, reached Jupiter, powered, instead of with RTGs, with solar panels. So you don't need this stuff at all. And furthermore, right now, and this is the newest thing, and you can read about it on Counterpunch. I just wrote a piece 2 weeks ago about this. What's being proposed is actual reactors, actual nuclear reactors using... It's
called the kilopower reactor using...
Kilopower reactor using...
They're calling it the Krusty.
Using uranium-235, and that's the isotope of uranium with fissions. The U-238, again, what that does is grab a neutron if it's in the proximity of fission and transforms itself into plutonium-239. 235 is what's the fuel in nuclear power plants, or like the Hiroshima bomb, 90% uranium-235. And so what NASA and working very closely with the Department of Energy is now working on is this kill is the right word, reactor, which would be used on the moon, on Mars, though in fact you can use, if you can harvest solar power when you're at Jupiter, you sure as can be can harvest solar power on the moon. I mean, the moon is just above us, and Mars isn't so far away. The amount of solar power that gets to Mars is a third of what hits the Earth. So you could have a moon colony, you could have a Mars colony, energized by solar, but they want to use nuclear. They want to make money. They want to, and there's this military angle too. I'll get to in a sec. So they would not only endanger an astronaut who would go to the moon and have to live in proximity to nuclear technology, but what's to happen when these things are launched? I mean, there's a failure rate of 1 in 100 with rockets on launch. So here you're going to have a nuclear reactor that's to be positioned on the moon or Mars, launched from Cape Canaveral, or that's where they've been launching these things through the years. And what if there's an accident? In fact, I got into this story, and listeners of your show will know this. I got into this story way back in 1985 when I read a Department of Energy newsletter relating how 2 space shuttles, we don't have any of them anymore, but for years they were these space shuttles, and 2 of them were to be launched, one being the Challenger in 1986 with onboard RTGs, radioisotope thermoelectric generators, with pounds of plutonium. In fact, the next mission of the ill-fated Challenger was to be in May 1986, lofting a plutonium-fueled RTG up into space, and then it would be sent off from space, be a space probe. Well, when the accident occurred in January, and because the documents I got under the Freedom of Information Act from NASA and the Department of Energy in late 85, it took me 10 months to get the documents, claimed that the likelihood of a catastrophic shuttle accident was infinitesimal, 1 in 100,000. So shouldn't worry. Well, the Challenger accident happened in January of 86, and it just showed that a shuttle accident wasn't some highly unlikely event. In fact, they soon changed the odds of a catastrophic shuttle accident from 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 74, and that's what got me on this story.
Oh my gosh, 1 in 100 to 1 in 74? They just
1 in 74, which turned out to be the correct odds, because out of 100 shuttle shots, there were 2, the Columbia and Challenger, 2 catastrophic failures. So it's 2 in 150, or basically 1 in 74. And then I started probing why using nuclear in space. I mean, obviously to keep Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, and at that point General Electric was the manufacturer of these RTGs, keep these corporations, keeping these national nuclear laboratories busy. But what else might be there that was causing NASA to use nuclear in space? And then I got to the weapons, and it turns out that Star Wars, and most people, even when Reagan was pushing Star Wars, were not cognizant of this. Star Wars was predicated on orbiting battle platforms on which there'd be laser weapons and hypervelocity beams, and be weapons that would be able to shoot their rays or shoot their whatevers down to the Earth, and they'd be energized by nuclear power, by super RTGs, or by actual nuclear reactors up above our heads. And in fact, a general who was heading at that point, they've changed the names of these nuclear in space initiatives through the years, but he was the head of then what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative. And he admitted at a conference, and I quote him in my book, The Wrong Stuff, that if we didn't have nuclear in space, you'd have to have a long extension cord reaching down to Earth. And now to get back to I hate to use his name, but the orange-haired man, Trump,
yes.
He is now pushing, he calls it the Space Force. In fact, right. I just saw him on television, as painful as that is, making a speech saying we have the Army and we have the Navy and we have the Air Force and we have the Marine Corps, and now we're going to have the Space Force, which, the plan all along, and this goes way, way, way back, is to have, Reagan was the big promoter of it, but it actually goes back to thinking by the U.S. Department of Defense in the 40s. After World War II, we brought over a lot of Nazi scientists in this country, to this country. Werner von Braun, for example, he was very, very much involved in, the Redstone rocket, which was the first rocket built by the U.S. that could carry an atomic bomb. That was based on Werner von Braun's V2 rocket. And he and the many other Nazi scientists, they were down there at Redstone in Alabama. I visited the place, doing stuff for the U.S. Involving rocketry. And, even before they arrived, let me read from my book called Weapons in Space.
Yes, do, because
page 84, or 85. It starts in 84, talking about the Redstone Arsenal and von Braun, and he became the technical director, and von Braun came to the United States, and there on the next page, I write about another high-level Nazi, former German Major General Walter Dornberger, who had been in charge of the entire Nazi rocket program, also becoming a powerful figure in the U.S. space program. And here I quote from the book Arming the Heavens, by a very well-done book by Professor Mano. He's also from here in New York. Quote, in 1947, Mano writes, as a consultant to the U.S. Air Force and advisor to the Department of Defense, Walter Dornberger wrote a planning paper for his new employees. He projected a system of hundreds of nuclear-armed satellites, all orbiting at different altitudes and angles, each capable of re-entering the atmosphere on command from Earth to proceed to its target. The Air Force began early work on Dornberger's idea under the acronym NABS, Nuclear Armed Bombardment Satellites. As a variation on NABS, Dornberger also proposed, and in my book, Weapons in Space, you can pick it up. That's not online, but it's inexpensive. It was, what was the original price? Very inexpensive, relatively speaking, $6.95. It's a short book. And also has some of the documents.
Is it available on Amazon?
Oh, yeah. And the introduction the foreword is by Dr. Michio Kaku. So if anybody says, well, Grossman's not a scientist, well, Michio Kaku sure is a scientist, and he writes the foreword of the book. So the thing is that for many years, in fact, even before Sputnik was launched, you have in the 50s, you have this thinking by the military to arm the heavens, as Mano writes, and that became very intense during the Reagan era. There was an eclipse during the Obama era. He was against weaponizing space, and I've been critical of Obama on a number of levels, and particularly his flip on nuclear power. He was against nuclear power plants when he ran for office, and then when he got into office, he was for it. And I've written a lot about why the pressure some of his advisors put him under and so forth. But he should have been smart enough to figure out the lethality of these machines. But now I
think he just caved, to be frank.
Yeah, me too. But now under Trump, it's not a matter of an intelligent president caving. You have a stupid president drinking the Kool-Aid, following what's been cooking for decades. The notion of of the U.S. military becoming, full spectrum dominance is what some of the military documents call what they'd like to do. They would be able to be masters of space and control the Earth from space. And I have begun to write about this. And again, you can see my pieces on Counterpunch. And Trump has bought this idea. And the flip side of this is that once the U.S. moves into space with nuclear-powered weapons and arms the heavens, just watch Russia, just watch China, just watch other nations, exactly. India and so. In fact, in terms
don't
of
you
how
think they're already doing it? Like, they know the U.S. is up to this. Don't you think they're already probably figuring out their own way to do these programs?
Well, I don't know, because for decades now, over 20 years, there's been this treaty. It's called the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. It's called the Paros Treaty, and it's been signed, promoted, pushed by nations all over the world. And in fact, the people pushing it the most, well, the nation pushing it absolutely the most is Canada. And then second, behind Canada, is Russia and China. They're all they want.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're still not doing it. I don't know about you, but I'm not so sure. Like, this is the thing. They know who they're dealing with. They know the United States is heading forward no matter what. Like, the United States has barely ever honored any of its treaties. Let's be clear.
We wouldn't sign. In fact, why the Paros Treaty has been...
So the United States just did not sign it.
We won't. And there's a Committee on Disarmament, which is like a component of the UN, meets in Geneva. And every year, Paros is brought up, and it's been stalled, it's been blocked, because as part of this committee's function, they look for consensus before they do anything. And let me just relate the story of an experience I had. Now, this is during the Clinton time. And I gave a presentation, a lecture, at the United Nations in Geneva, which is originally the headquarters of the old League of Nations. And the UN, when it was created, then started its major headquarters in New York, but also began rebuilding that League of Nations headquarters for a UN facility. And I was asked to be, by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the keynote speaker at an event at the UN on an arms race in outer space. And one of the things I did is, and I showed slides on some of these documents I'm talking about today, and talked about how the U.S. is into putting weapons in space, nuclear-powered weapons in space. Yeah. The next day, there's to be a vote, again, another vote at the UN in Geneva on Paros. And I'm walking to see what's going to happen. And during my speech, my presentation the day before, the UN ambassador there, he was like looking at me with like spears were coming out of his eyes. He was so angry. But I'm a pretty friendly fellow. And so on my way to the UN the next day, I see the ambassador. And he sees me, and I wave to him, friendly-like. And he comes over to me to try to correct me. And what he says, essentially, in fact, more than essentially, I wrote down what he said afterwards. He said, the war in Vietnam showed that we, the United States, can't field large numbers of troops. The United States population gets very upset. But what we can do, he says, is project power from space. And he goes on about that. Then I say, yeah, but just what I said 5 minutes ago. I said, if we do that, so will the Chinese, so will the Russians, and any advantage we would have would be lost. He responds, and I remember this so clearly, and again, this is about 15 years ago. He says, the Chinese are 30 years behind us in terms of space. And I said, I've been to China. Actually, I was in China to attend the women's conference years ago in Beijing, and China is not 30 years behind. I mean, it's done. In fact, these days it's quite. It has its little space station of its own up in space. I mean, it's quite proficient in terms of space. And I say, as to the Russians, I've been to. In fact, I visited Russia as a guest of environmental organizations in Russia when there was that opening after the fall of communism, and there was Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The environmental advisor to Yeltsin, Alexei Yablokov, invited me to Russia to speak about the dangers of nuclear power. He was very anti-nuclear and very much concerned. Well, he died last year, Alexei, a famed biologist. Their Rachel Carson. And I said, I visited in Russia their space museum. And it's a little weird. I mean, you walk in and initially they put dogs in space, and they got the dogs back and they stuffed the dogs, and you see these stuffed dogs.
Really?
Yeah. Well, you see that there are space museums. And I'm telling the U.S. ambassador, I said, they were up first with Sputnik. They're not behind us. I said, if the U.S. turns space into a new war zone, we're going to be facing the Russians, we're going to be facing the Chinese, and the expense. I mean, if one is concerned about money, to put weapons in space is not like buying a tank or even some of these fancy new destroyers. I mean, we're talking about spending our treasure on arming the heavens with, as I say, no advantage. I mean, like after the war, we thought for a while that we'd have an exclusive in atomic bombs. And though there were some people who said it's time now to make an agreement to denuclearize the planet, we balked because we thought we had this exclusive. Before you know it, the Russians, or then it was the Soviet Union, exploded an atomic bomb, and then, lo and behold, the hydrogen bomb, and later the Chinese did it. So there was no exclusive.
Don't you think putting nuclear weapons in space makes the United States territory very vulnerable to attack? Because if we have this threat to other nations, if you do anything to us, we're going to bomb you. I would think if I were an opposing nation, they can't stop the weapons in outer space, but they certainly could go after the territory of the United States to make an effort to destroy its government. Do you know what I mean? I think that puts a target on our back that is just off the charts.
Well, the thing is, they would do that because they would see the U.S., as a terrible threat. Let me just finish the story about Paros and Geneva. So
Please do.
There's this vote at the UN, and I'm sitting there in the chambers, the old League of Nations chambers, where Haile Selassie gave that speech when Ethiopia was being, faced invasion by the Italians. In fact, very historic, old murals, very interesting. But in any case, there I'm sitting in the balcony, and I'm watching the panel below, and there's that ambassador that I had spoke to in the street before, an hour before, who said, the Chinese 30 years behind. What he said about the Russians, too, I didn't mention, is that the Russians don't have the money to do this. And I say, well, not only do they have the technical prowess, but the thing about Russia today as well is that they have all kind of minerals, and there's all kind of natural wealth in Russia that they can convert into rubles. And so don't think that they're a penniless nation at all. In any case, I'm watching him, the League of Nations in Geneva, do this vote, and there's one vote after another, yes, 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 prevention of an arms race in outer space. And my friend, the ambassador, raises his hand, no. And that's the end of, for that day, probably that year, for decades, prevention of an arms race in outer space. Then I go to lunch, and down at lunch, also in the day before, not only did I speak, but they also showed Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, an hour-long documentary I had done called Nukes in Space, the Nuclearization and Weaponization of the Heavens, which Google Nukes in Space, my documentary, see if you can get it. I don't know who is distributing now, but it's a powerful documentary. And in any case, they showed it in Geneva. After this, well, again, I keynoted the conference, but the next to speak was the ambassador from China, saying we need a prevention of an arms race in outer space treaty, and then, in any case, I walk in to have lunch in the dining room, and there I see a bunch of young Chinese men who wave me over, and they're part of the delegation of China, and they had seen the film the day before. They had heard my speech and seen the documents I put up about U.S. This whole history of the U.S. seeking to weaponize space, and they heard their own ambassadors speak about how we don't want an arms race in outer space. And I sat down. Now, I don't know if you can believe these guys, but these were young men in their 20s. And they looked at me and they said, look, we're trying to build a country. And this is 15 years ago, before China went through the enormous transformation it's gone through in terms of development in recent years. 15, maybe 20 years ago, this one. And they look at me and says, we're trying to feed 1 billion people. We're trying to house 1 billion people. We're trying to provide health care for 1 billion people. And we don't want to waste our resources. We don't want to waste our money on weaponizing space. But he said, if your country is going to do it, if the United States is going to do it, we're going to have to do it. And wow. I leave the listener with that. And again, go back to Reagan. He said, trust but verify. Maybe you can't trust anybody. But my gut feeling, speaking to these young men trying to build a country and not wanting to see their treasure wasted on nuclear-powered battle platforms in space, made me feel that, there was some credibility there. And in any case, we're now today with Trump, and he wants the Space Force. He's talking about, as he said during the campaign.
He's given free rein to the military. He basically told them, "You guys are on your own." I mean, he will say he will do anything that any of them want. So he doesn't have really the depth of knowledge to comprehend what he's promoting, or even this concept of, like, now they're going all out on this nuclear reactor in space, these nuclear space weapons, and all of this stuff. They have no comprehension. Intellectual comprehension of the capacity, not only the direct threat to the United States from other nations, but what it could do to our planet.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if some of the listeners, are like Trekkies. I have a son who's like a Trekkie, loves the Star Trek series. I mean, if there are nuclear-powered weapons in space, and in fact, there's weapons in space, and there's a shooting war, space would be so littered with debris, a lot of it nuclear debris. There'd be, when the shuttle was being launched, NASA had to coordinate with the Space Command, which is part of the U.S. Air Force, which checks on debris in space to make sure that there was a clear path up. If there was a shooting war in space, there'd be so much debris, we'd be stuck on this planet for, we wouldn't be able to get up and out. No, but it's the weaponization of space.
Well, think of all the satellites. If something went wrong up there, think about, our planet now operates on satellites. I mean, this is how simple it is. I heard a guy a long time ago say, if we really wanted to threaten the West, we'd shoot a missile up at your satellites full of nails. So that's not the point here. You know what I mean?
I would say it's like a terrorist weapon in space. Incidentally, before we go any further...
Me too, but I do want to say this. The nukes in space, the rainbow bombs, is that what you're talking about, narrated by William Shatner?
No. I did my own TV documentary.
Okay.
It's called Nukes in Space, the Nuclearization and Weaponization of the Heavens.
Wow.
And then I did 2 half-hour, that's an hour documentary, and I did 2 half-hour documentaries that followed. One was Star Wars Returns, which involves what was happening under the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, when they were looking to resurrect the Reagan Star Wars program. But just Google Nukes in Space,
is it on your
the
website?
Nuclearization and Weaponization of the Heavens, and put my name in. And I'm sure there's stuff on YouTube, or stuff, if not the whole video, segments of the video, and see it. And before I go any further, listeners, I'm probably, from what I'm saying, will say, well, what can I do? What can I do? One of the things that people should do is to join the leading organization fighting this madness, and that's an incredible organization. That's the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. The Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. The coordinator is just the most marvelous fellow, Bruce Gagnon, Gagnon. And you can go right to their website, which is www, and then space4, and it's the number 4, peace.org, space4peace.org. And it's been around now for 26 years. It was organized in Washington, but now every year meets in various places around the world. This spring it'll be in England, and it has an international base, people from all over the world, and lots of people from the United States. And you should get involved. Again, the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. They need people, and they need people to spread the message and to act. Whenever they have these meetings, these gatherings, they do demonstrations because they feel talking is not enough. They feel we have to act, and they seek to act politically as well. No, it's a wonderful group, Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. And just to repeat the URL again, www, and then space4, the numeral 4, peace.org. And you should get involved. It's based in Maine, and very, very active. There's other groups involved in this issue.
That I'm on the radio. I heard you on Helen Caldicott's show, I think in 2012 or 2000. Yeah, it was 2012. And you said everybody needs to get engaged because this is becoming really serious. This is big, and it is really big.
It's something that, like I didn't know until I read in this Department of Energy newsletter many years ago, almost 30 years ago, about the shuttle being used to loft these plutonium fuel space probes.
Wow.
I just didn't know. A lot of this stuff, weapons in space, in fact, is in the black, what they call in the black, secretly done by the military. In fact, even during the Obama administration, I believe the military continued with some of this stuff because of Obama was against it, but in the black they were able to pull it off. But in any case, nothing's in the black now. Now we have Trump, and he's full speed ahead.
That's why it's urgent. We have 10 seconds left. I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you short, but you've been listening with Karl Grossman, Lonnie Clark on the Age of Fission. Thank you, KEPW. Thank you, Karl. Put your courage feet on, you guys. Thanks, Karl.
A pleasure.